Hey guys, tonight we wander into a fog thicker than time itself. It creeps along cobbled roads, curls beneath the heavy cloaks of night watchmen, and settles behind cathedral walls. You can feel it breathing on your neck. Tonight, you don't just hear about monsters, you live in a world where they're real enough that people built walls against them, drew them on maps, prayed until their knees bruised, all to keep them at bay. These weren't fantasy beasts made for entertainment. No, these were existential threats, incarnations of sin, warning signs scribbled in ink and fire, and if you were there, let's just say you wouldn't have lasted long unless you kept garlic, a holy relic, and a solid understanding of Latin on hand. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You don't just wake up in the Middle Ages, you arrive. Your boots crunch against wet gravel. The mist is so thick, it swallows sound. You can't see 5 steps ahead. And somehow, the world behind you has already vanished. Ahead looms a wooden gate fortified, spiked, and freshly smeared with ash. Someone's painted a sigil above it, a crude symbol of a sword piercing a worm-like serpent. A small bell rings somewhere. Though you see no bell tower, then a voice dry, low asks, "Traveller or beast?" You're in a village clinging to the edge of belief and fear, where every unknown traveller might be a monster in disguise, and you're already under suspicion. Medieval people didn't believe monsters existed, they knew they did. They'd read about them in bestiaries, heard about them from priests, seen them carved into the stonework of churches. The world, to them, was a battleground between good and evil, constantly playing out in both visible and invisible realms. And monsters were the symptoms of a diseased soul or a sinful society. They didn't just imagine dragons because they liked spicy stories. No, dragons curled through their nightmares because they stood for Satan himself. They symbolized gluttony, greed and rage, and had to be slain not with swords but with piety. And let's be clear, these monsters weren't always where you'd expect. They weren't lurking in caves or oceans. Sometimes they sat next to you at the marketplace. The idea of monstrous races, humanoid creatures living at the edges of the known world wasn't metaphorical. Scholars in the 12th century truly believed that tribes of people existed with dog heads, feet shaped like umbrellas, or mouths in their chests. Some were thought to be descendants of Cain, others simply malformed by distance from Eden. You duck under the archway and step inside. The fog doesn't lift, it follows. You pass villagers sharpening pitchforks, hanging bundles of garlic, muttering prayers under their breath. A child carries a candle in one hand and a wooden cross in the other. Even the animals seem uneasy. You reach the village square, where a priest is nailing a parchment to a post. It reads, "Beware the wild hunt. Travel not after sunset. Lock your windows. Cleanse your soul." And then it hits you, this isn't just about keeping physical safety. The line between spiritual and physical was blurred. To them, sin didn't stay inside, it changed the world around you. If your community was sinful, monsters would come. If you were impure, you might become one. Take the tale of the Cynocephali, and the dog-headed men. Medieval people believed these creatures had human bodies and canine heads, and yet they weren't always considered evil. Some were even thought to be Christians, who simply looked monstrous, but lived righteous lives. Saint Christopher, in some traditions, was said to be a cynocephalus, who converted after hearing the gospel. Try putting that in your Sunday school curriculum. But still, trust was rare. Imagine walking through a town square and people whispering, "He travels too much. Probably seen demons. Maybe brought one back." There's a man selling talismans, a rabbit's foot, dried herbs, and a shriveled frog. You buy one. Why? Because here, skepticism gets you killed, or worse, changed. A woman stumbles out of a house, clutching her chest, wailing about a shadow at the edge of her field. The villagers gather. No one questions her. Instead, they nod. They know what she means. It's not a bear, not a thief, something older and darker. It's back. Someone whispers, "Now." Here's a little-known historical gem. Some towns held regular monster hunts, where entire communities would gear up to search for lurking beasts, often as a way to release social pressure or reinforce moral boundaries. If the monsters weren't found, someone got accused anyway, usually a widow, a foreigner, or that one guy who asked too many questions. Poor Gregor. Shouldn't have questioned the priest's Latin. But what made these monsters real wasn't their physical presence. It was their power to explain the unexplainable. Failed crops, demon, stillbirth witch, the bubonic plague, wrath of a sea serpent, or maybe Jews poisoning wells, as the horrific rumours went. And yes, that's where some of Europe's most terrifying anti-Semitic myths began, via monstrous rationalisation. You sit beside a fire with a local hunter. His eyes are bloodshot. He talks about the eyes in the woods. They never blink. They glow. Sometimes they whisper. You ask, "Did you ever see them up close?" He pauses. "No," he says, "but they see me." And here comes our academic wildcard. Historians still debate whether some of these sightings were natural phenomena, misinterpreted through cultural lenses like ball lightning mistaken for spirits, or rabid animals inspiring tales of demons. But the fact remains, fear didn't need proof, just belief. You move to leave, but the hunter grabs your arm. If you hear your name whispered at night, don't answer, even if it's your mother's voice. You nod, half joking, but then you hear it, a soft voice behind you, saying your name. You turn, no one there, just the fog, and the sigil on the gate, still bleeding fresh ash. Welcome to the Middle Ages. You find yourself inside a cold stone room, lit only by a tallow candle flickering in a draught. The wind moans through the narrow slits in the wall, but you're not alone. In front of you lies an open book. Its yellowed pages crack like old skin. This is no ordinary manuscript. This is a bestiary, a medieval encyclopedia of creatures both majestic and monstrous. And tonight, you get to read it as they did not as fiction, but as fact, gospel, and warning. The ink smells faintly of iron and mildew. The first page shows a lion, standing tall and regal, its face oddly human-like, according to the text. The lion erases its tracks with its tail so that hunters cannot follow. A spiritual metaphor, perhaps, but to the people of the 12th century, it was also natural history. In the world you've entered, lions don't just roar, they kneel to the virtuous. Snakes don't just slither, they commit suicide when captured. And snails. Snails are warlike creatures, often depicted in illuminated manuscripts, doing battle against armoured knights. Why scholars still argue about it. Some think it symbolised cowardice, others believe it mocked feudal power, and a few suspect that monks were just really bored and needed something absurdly entertaining to doodle. As you turn the pages, you meet the manticore, a red beast with the body of a lion, the face of a man, and a tail full of venomous spines, supposedly. It mimicked human speech to lure victims. Sounds like a medieval version of a YouTube comment section, doesn't it? Then comes the bonnekin, a beast that looks like a bull but defends itself by flinging burning poop. Yes, you heard that right. Fiery feces. It might sound like something from a bathroom joke book, but medieval people believed it lived in Asia Minor. Why Asia Minor? Simple. If something was strange, frightening or gross, it was usually placed far, far away, just over the horizon, where no one could fact-check it. This use of distant lands as monster habitats wasn't lazy, it was logical. Europe was considered the civilized centre, while the edges of the map were morally and physically corrupted. That's why the margins of medieval Mappae Mundi world maps are teeming with cyclopes, Blemmy's headless people with faces on their chests, and Cyapod's one-footed creatures who use their giant foot as an umbrella. And here's your weird but true historical tidbit. Some medieval people believed these beings were simply distorted descendants of Adam and Eve, warped by generations of sin and distance from the Word. The farther you were from the church, the more monstrous you became, literally. You flip the page again and come to the phoenix. Ah, finally something beautiful. But don't get too comfortable. This fiery bird dies in flame and resurrects in ash, not because it's majestic, but because it represents the suffering and rebirth of Christ, even loveliness. Here, must bleed first. A knock at the wooden door jolts you. A monk enters. Robe damp with rain. He glances at the book, then at you. Be careful. He says, the words in that book, they remember being believed. You look back at the text, the next page a unicorn, glorious and graceful, deadly. You read, the unicorn may only be tamed by a virgin. Again. The symbolism is thick, you get it. Chastity, purity, control of dangerous beauty. But for medieval readers, this wasn't just a metaphor. Many truly believed unicorns roamed far-off lands and were hunted for their spiralled horns, which were said to detect poison. Wealthy nobles even bought narwhal tusks passed off as unicorn horns, paying enormous sums for protection from invisible threats. The medieval version of buying overpriced essential oils. Really, suddenly, the candle flickers violently. You feel a presence. The monk is gone. In his place is a low sound, a whispering and maybe chanting no. It's the book. The bestiary has turned a page by itself. This time, you see a pelican. But not like any pelican you've ever seen. This one is tearing open its own chest to feed its young with blood. It's grotesque, touching, and deeply symbolic. For Christians of the time, the pelican was Christ, sacrificing himself to nourish the unworthy. Which raises the question how many children mistook real pelicans for divine birds and approached them with bread and a hymn. Answer, we don't know. But probably a few traumatized medieval kids exist solely because of that imagery. You shut the book. Enough beasts for now. But the monsters aren't confined to pages. As you exit the scriptorium, you see gargoyles perched on the cathedral walls. Their eyes follow you. Their mouths are wide open, ready to spew water or curses. These grotesques weren't just decorative, they were guardians, watching over a sinful world from sacred places. Their ugliness was meant to frighten the evil away, or maybe remind the townsfolk what was waiting for them if they strayed. Here's a morsel for your midnight mind. Some theologians argued that the church used monstrous imagery as both a warning and an invitation. See what awaits you if you sin, they'd say, but also see how even monsters can serve God. You walk past the graveyard, and you swear something moves among the tombstones. Maybe it's your imagination, maybe not. You remember what the monk said the book remembers being believed, and perhaps, after tonight, so will you. The wind is sharper tonight. It bites your cheeks as you step into the narrow alley between the baker's shed and the small, shuttered chapel. The scent of smoke and damp moss clings to the air. You pause. Somewhere above, a wooden shutter creaks slowly open, then shuts. No candlelight. No words, just the unsettling sense that someone, or something, has been watching you. This is where belief goes beyond books. It slips into your daily routine, your sleep, your breath. Tonight, you'll learn why demons weren't just theological concepts. They were neighbours, roommates. That strange rattle in the wall, not a mouse. Possibly a soul trapped in purgatory. Let's be clear in the medieval mindset. The supernatural wasn't out there. It was in here. Behind doors, beneath pillows, on your tongue if you said the wrong words in the dark. You duck into a peasant's cottage, invited in by a weary farmer who sees the unease in your eyes. His hearth glows low, casting twitchy shadows along the ceiling. A woman stirs a pot of lentils. 2 children sit in silence. No one speaks until the farmer leans in close and whispers, "We think something's got the baby." Your stomach tightens. God. She cries differently now. She won't meet her mother's eyes. She laughs too much, too often. This is no horror story. This is a changeling, a creature swapped in by fairies or demons, depending on the village's law. And yes, it's a real belief that persisted in parts of Europe for centuries. Changelings explained developmental disabilities, sudden illness, even colic. One monk wrote that the best way to test if a child was a demon was to boil eggshells and observe the infant's reaction. Quick historical fact, one woman in 16th century Ireland was burned alive because her husband believed she'd been replaced by a demon. His proof: she drank too much tea. Medieval logic. Folks, the farmer's wife begins reciting a prayer under her breath. Not Latin too dangerous if mispronounced. Just old words passed down through generations, meant to ward off spirits. You realise this family isn't afraid of monsters. They live with the assumption they're already inside. Outside the window, a scratching sound starts, then stops. You don't move. The church was very clear on this: demons could enter through any sin left unconfessed, any mind left idle, any room left unguarded. Lost. That's an open window. Pride a broken latch. Gluttony might as well hang a welcome sign. And here's your required strange but true detail. Medieval people believed demons could sit on your chest while you slept, whisper impure dreams into your ears, or even twist your limbs in the night. The condition we now call sleep paralysis was once thought to be a sure sign of demonic oppression. You didn't need a diagnosis, you needed an exorcism. You step outside and head toward the chapel. You're drawn there, like moss to stone, like sin to silence. Inside, a priest kneels before the altar, muttering furiously. You hear one word repeated over and over: temptatio, temptation. The priest sees you and recoils, not because of you, but because something behind you has followed you in. You turn. There's nothing there. Of course not. Or maybe it's cleverer than that. Now, for your scholarly debate of the night, some historians argue that widespread belief in demons was a psychological mechanism for explaining trauma, anxiety, or even PTSD in a world constantly threatened by famine, war, and plague. Others believe it was a power structure, the church using invisible enemies to control visible behaviour. Either way, you can't shake the feeling that something is riding your shadow. The priest warns you not to speak during the hours between midnight and cockcrow. He says this is when the veil is thinnest, when hell listens closely. Then he presses a talisman into your hand, a small circle of metal, etched with words that look suspiciously like bad Latin. You don't argue, you just take it. Back at the cottage, the baby is quiet now, too quiet. The family has placed garlic above the door. A broom lies across the threshold, bristles out meant to confuse any dark spirit, forcing it to count each straw before entering. Yes, that was a real folk tradition across parts of Europe. Demons apparently struggled with math. You lie down on a straw mattress in the corner, exhausted but alert. Every creak sounds like a claw. Every breeze feels like breath. And then the dreams begin. They aren't yours. They're vivid, loud, too red. You see beasts walking on two legs. You see monks ripping pages from books and eating them. You see yourself standing in the centre of a burning village, speaking a language you've never learned. You wake up gasping, cold sweat on your chest. The farmer is already awake. Saw something, he asks. You nod. He just mutters. Everyone does. And it's not over. You step outside to relieve yourself, and see something etched into the dirt beside the barn, a footprint, larger than any human's, pointed like a goat's but spread like a bird's. It steams faintly. The villagers gather at dawn. A cow's been found dead, tongue missing, eyes hollowed, no blood, just emptiness. They don't cry, they don't scream, they start praying. One old woman walks in circles, tossing salt, whispering in two languages. One of them might not be human. And you start to understand it. This isn't superstition. This is survival. It was easier to believe in demons than to accept chaos. Easier to explain tragedy as punishment than randomness. When your crops failed and your wife died in childbirth and your cousin disappeared into the woods and came back speaking in rhymes, belief was the only defence. And when enough people believed that belief had gravity, it shaped the rules, bent time, rewrote the air. Something laughs far off in the woods, high-pitched, almost joyful. You don't look. You know better now. The priest was right. Some doors don't need to open. They just need to be heard. You wake to the sound of ropes tightening. A creaky ship sways beneath your feet. The world smells of salt, tar, and dried fish. The sky is a bruised grey, and the sea sloshes against the hull with a kind of purpose, like it's whispering something old and unfinished. This isn't a dream. You've become a traveller in the medieval world, and you're aboard a merchant vessel bound for the edge of the known map, and where you're going it's not just unknown, it's infested. Maps in this era aren't for directions, they're for warnings. In fact, some of the most famous medieval mappamundi are so packed with monsters around the edges, you'd be forgiven for thinking they were fantasy art. But no, these were serious attempts to depict truth. You're headed beyond the Pillars of Hercules, past the Orkney Isles, toward lands labelled only with trembling Latin phrases, hic sunt dracones. Here be dragons. The sailors are a nervous lot. They mutter about sea serpents and whirlpools that suck down entire fleets. One tells you of an island shaped like a woman's face, where sirens sing in reverse. Another swears he saw a whale so large. A monastery was built on its back before it dove into the abyss, monks and all. Sounds fake to you. Yes, but back then, these tales were cargo traded and treasured like spices and silk. You pass the time reading an old seafarer's journal. The entries grow more fevered with every page. North of the Caspian we saw the blemmies, men without heads, their eyes and mouths in their chests. We offered bread to the cyropods, one-legged men, who shaded themselves with their giant foot. They declined politely. In Greek, a woman birthed a child with scales in the Constantinople. It screamed in perfect Hebrew before dying. Academic consensus today suggests many of these stories came from confused reports, misidentifications, or creative liberties taken by monks who hadn't left their scriptoriums in decades. But that's the thing about monsters in medieval travel lore. They weren't just embellishments. They were explanations, rational ways to process irrational encounters. If someone looked different, dressed strangely, or ate foods you didn't recognize, they weren't just foreigners. They were possibly monstrous. Let's pause here for our historical side note. Many medieval texts describe monstrous races like the Panotis, people with ears so large they used them as blankets. Why? Because human difference had to be spiritualized. Physical variation was seen as evidence of moral deviation, or divine punishment, or simply geography being unholy. Now back to your ship. A storm begins to churn. The mast groans like an old man with bad knees. The captain shouts orders. The sky splits open. You cling to the railing, soaked and shaking, and just when you think it can't get worse, a shadow passes beneath the boat. Not a whale, not a reef, something older. You reach for the bestiary you foolishly brought on board. You find an entry leviathan. It's described as a massive sea monster that embodies chaos and God's wrath. It can't be slain, only survived. Supposedly. The world will end when Leviathan fights Behemoth on Judgment Day. Cool bedtime thought, right. The storm fades at last, leaving your ship splintered but afloat. The crew falls silent. You've drifted somewhere new, an island with black sand and giant bones scattered like broken furniture. No birds, no waves, just stillness. A sailor mutters, "We're too far. We shouldn't be here." But curiosity wins. It always does. You and a small group set foot on land. The bones human, but twisted. One has ribs that curve outward, like wings. Another's skull has a third eye socket. There's a stone pillar nearby etched with words in no known language, and beneath it, a carving of a human figure kneeling before a creature with 7 arms and no face. Your guide says it's from the east, or Africa, or somewhere between. That's the thing edges are slippery in medieval geography. Suddenly, someone screams. You run and find a sailor collapsed, pointing. There's a trail of footprints bare. human-shaped, but far too deep, as if something heavy and invisible had walked there moments ago. You sprint back to the ship, at sea again. Things are different. The crew no longer sings. One man plucks at invisible threads in the air, another whispers to himself in a language no one knows. You feel eyes at night, not on the horizon, but on your thoughts. It's said that travellers who went too far risked losing not just their way, but their shape. That's the real fear here, not being eaten by monsters, but becoming one. Here's a peculiar piece of truth. Many medieval Christian thinkers believed distant tribes weren't damned unless they rejected the gospel. So monstrous peoples, no matter how bizarre, could theoretically still be saved. But they had to hear the word first. Hence, missionaries were often sent into dangerous lands not just to convert, but to confirm if these monsters had souls. Imagine debating salvation over tea with a person whose head is in their chest. The real miracle might be table manners. The ship finally returns home. You're thinner, paler, twitchier. The locals don't recognize you. Some call you cursed. Others want to hear your tales. You don't share them. Some things are better left beyond the edge. But even now, at night, when the fog rolls in over the docks, you hear humming, low, not quite human, and you wonder not if monsters exist, but if you ever stopped being one. The candlelight flickers across carved stone walls as you sit stiffly in a pew, knees aching, heart uncertain. You're in a cathedral, vast and echoing, where incense mingles with the damp of centuries. Stained glass glows like fire in the late afternoon sun, and every shadow seems to lean in, listening. A sermon is beginning, but this one isn't about mercy, it's about monsters. The priest's voice is low and rhythmic, drawing you in like a spell. Beware the dragon, he intones, for it guards treasure, but the price of that treasure is your soul. You're not sure whether he means an actual beast or a metaphor, but in this age, it doesn't matter. Dragons are real. They live not just in distant mountains or old stories, but in the margins of belief. They represent sin so consuming, it can take wing. Tonight, you discover that in the medieval mind, monsters weren't distractions from faith. They were tools of it. You shift on the cold wooden bench. A small girl beside you is drawing something on a wax tablet, a man fighting a snake. Her mother snatches it away with a harsh whisper, "Don't tempt them." You realise then that monsters weren't just talked about in sermons. They were feared into people, into children, into sleep. Take the dragon. For example, most people today think of dragons as majestic, noble, fire-breathing reptiles, but to medieval folks they were sin incarnate. The dragon didn't just hoard gold, it hoarded corruption, tempting knights with wealth, vanity, and pride. Slaying it wasn't an act of heroism, it was a spiritual exorcism. St. George didn't kill a beast, he killed temptation. And yes, there's your scholarly dispute moment. Historians still debate whether St. George's story was entirely fabricated as church propaganda, or based loosely on real events twisted through the lens of hagiography. Either way, the dragon became less a lizard and more a moral symbol. The priest continues, "The leviathan of the sea is gluttony, the basilisk of the desert is envy, the werewolf of the forest is wrath without reason." Wait, werewolf. You glance around, no one else reacts, because to them, that's not odd, it's theology. The church of the time leaned hard into allegory. Monsters were crafted and classified to represent specific sins, and just like a naturalist cataloguing birds, theologians wrote entire treatises on demons with goat legs who whispered pride into your dreams, or witches who rode beasts shaped like lust itself. And let's talk about the devil for a second. He wasn't the sleek, red-horned cartoon character we know today. In the early Middle Ages, Satan could take many forms: snake, dog, man, woman, mist, illness, temptation in the form of cheese. Yes, really. There's a record of a monk refusing a particularly creamy wheel of brie because he believed it had been sent by Satan to test his fasting. You're welcome. You move through the cathedral after the sermon ends, following a procession of monks into a side chapel. There, carved into the archway, are grotesque images, twisted beasts, human-animal hybrids, serpents swallowing their own tails. They're not random decorations, they're lessons. You're supposed to be repulsed and afraid. You pause at a depiction of a woman with horns and 3 eyes nursing a shadowy figure. No plaque, just silence. But someone behind you murmurs, "She is sin. The child is consequence." You shiver. And then there's the devil at court. Yes, actual court, in certain inquisitorial trials. People were asked whether they'd seen monstrous figures or consorted with beasts during dreams. One peasant claimed she had been visited nightly by a man with cloven hooves and a wolf's head who taught her Latin. Instead of praising her newfound bilingualism, the church decided she was consorting with Satan. This was no anomaly. The line between monster and human, animal and soul, was fluid. Which brings us to your academic fact of the evening De Animali Bus by Albertus Magnus. A 13th century scholar tried to categorize animals not just by biology, but by spiritual impact. For example, owls creatures of the night, symbols of Satan's watchfulness. Cats also suspect especially black ones. Sorry, Salem. You enter the cathedral crypt. It's darker here, quieter. You brush your hand against a stone sarcophagus. There's an inscription, Custos contra infernum, guardian against hell. It's a knight's tomb. Probably someone who joined a crusade not necessarily to fight people, but to fight the devil's influence. Crusades weren't always portrayed as wars against humans. Often, they were framed as divine monster hunts, cleansing the holy land of evil, sometimes embodied in grotesque forms in sermons, sometimes as other religions. And here we land on a disturbing truth. Monstrous metaphors were often used to dehumanize. Jews, Muslims, even heretical Christians were portrayed as beastly in medieval art and texts, sometimes with snouts, tails, or extra eyes. You hear footsteps behind you. A monk approaches and offers you a candle. To keep them at bay, he says. You hesitate, them. He doesn't answer. He just walks away, humming a tune in Gregorian plainchant. You're not sure if it's a hymn or a warning. You head toward the exit, past the Stations of the Cross. At the final image, Christ faces a snarling black creature at the base of the cross. It isn't in your Bible, but it's here, because to this church, salvation means confronting monsters your own, and everyone else's. Outside, the wind feels colder. You glance back at the cathedral, just as the gargoyle above the door seems to twitch. You tell yourself it's the wind. But in this world, doubt is an invitation, and belief is armor. You're led by torchlight through the courtyard of a noble estate, deep into a garden that smells overwhelmingly of damp soil, lilies, and something reptilian. The servant guiding you says nothing, only gestures ahead to a heavy iron door. It opens with a reluctant groan. Inside, a strange menagerie awaits one that makes you question everything you think you know about real animals. Welcome to the medieval zoo. No, not the kind with neatly labelled enclosures and guided tours. This is a collection of creatures gathered by nobles, merchants, and monks, half out of curiosity, half out of fear, and completely misunderstood. You pass by a large, nervous animal chained to a post. It flaps its ears and reaches for hay with a coiling trunk. An elephant. But the monk recording this encounter in his journal describes it as a beast shaped like a knight's warhorse, with a serpent for a nose, and knees that bend backwards. Charming. To medieval eyes, animals were only partially of this world. They had meanings, moral associations, and spiritual messages. Real or imagined, they were symbols first, biology second, which is how you end up with people claiming that crocodiles cry tears while devouring their prey, not because it's scientifically accurate, spoiler, it's not, but because it makes a killer metaphor for false repentance. So here comes our first academic sprinkle Of the night crocodile tears as a phrase is not modern. It traces back to medieval bestiaries, where crocodiles were shown as evil creatures who mourn while murdering, a lesson wrapped in scales and teeth. You wander past a cage made of ironwood. Inside is a beaver, aggressively gnawing at a stick. Sounds normal until the nobleman beside you begins reciting a strange tale. They chew off their own testicles when chased, to appease hunters. You pause mid-step. What? He nods. Dead serious. It's a known fact. That's why their genitals are so highly prized, powerful in potions. Let's just take a beat here. Medieval bestiaries, again. Describe beavers as creatures so committed to escaping danger that they'd willingly self-mutilate. Why? Because monks loved a good allegory. The beaver becomes the image of repentance, casting away sinful pleasure to save the soul. Yikes. In truth, beavers don't do any of that. But medieval science wasn't based on observation, it was based on meaning. You now stand before a lioness. She paces, tail flicking, regal, controlled. The text beside her, handwritten on vellum, reads, "The lion fears only the rooster's crow. He will not attack a virgin. He wakes his cubs with a roar." That last part completely made up. But again, it's all metaphor. The lion, king of beasts, becomes a stand-in for Christ noble, brave, and, depending on the story, very picky about roommates. You pass a strange cage lined with glass bottles. Inside, a chameleon climbs its branch. But the local law says it doesn't change colour. It's invisible to sinless men and glows red near witches. Now we're in deep. This is the era when real creatures were mutated into moral tools. Owls symbolised stupidity or secret wisdom. Snakes represented Satan, except when they represented resurrection. Peacocks were proof of vanity. Foxes were deceivers, except in one tale, where a fox dressed as a priest and was accused of heresy. And yes, we have a record of a medieval court trial where a rooster was sentenced to death for laying an egg. That's your historical oddity for this chapter. You're welcome. You enter a back room where a massive glass tank holds what looks like a large fish with a humanoid face. The nobleman whispers, "Caught off the coast of Normandy. Mermaids breed storms." The creature is dead now, probably a large seal or manatee, distorted by decay. But the drawing beside it shows a full-lipped woman combing her hair with fish bones, eyes wide and empty. Some theologians argued that mermaids might have souls. Others said no, they were demons in disguise. Either way, people were terrified of them. Sailors were warned, don't look at her, don't listen, don't dream of the sea too long, or you might answer a voice that isn't your own. You move along, past exhibits more and more disturbing. A two-headed calf in brine, a dried lizard labelled basilisk, a dead weasel coiled around what is labelled a sin stone, a rock said to cause immediate miscarriage if held by an unwed woman. At the end of the hall, you find something unexpected, a mirror. Above it, a plaque reads, "The most dangerous creature in this hall." You stare at your reflection. Behind you, shadows flicker, but the room is still, just your heartbeat, and the weight of centuries of fear pressed into every cage and jar. This zoo wasn't built to entertain. It was built to warn, to moralise, to flatten the chaotic beauty of nature into boxes labelled vice or virtue. Here's your historian callback. Many scholars now believe these natural collections shaped early scientific thought. But in reverse, instead of removing myth from biology, they began by applying myth to biology, and slowly had to unlearn it all. But even now, we haven't shaken it completely. Think of how we still call someone a snake or talk about playing possum. The beast never really leaves the parable. As you walk back through the garden, you hear a strange laugh, not animal, not human. You don't turn around. You've learned something here even when caged. Monsters still teach, and some mirrors bite back. You wake up in the middle of the woods. There's fog on your skin and moss beneath your fingertips. Something rustles beyond the trees, but it's not an animal. It's not even alive. Not in the way you understand life. No. What stirs out there is an idea, a legend with claws. Tonight, You're not walking through stories, you're walking through belief. And belief, in the Middle Ages, is rarely soft and fluffy. It bites. You stumble onto a dirt path, worn by generations of bare feet and hoofprints. This is pilgrimage territory. But the markers on the trees aren't crosses or arrows. They're painted monsters, fanged, winged, or completely indescribable. Travellers in the past didn't just fear robbers or wild boars. They feared them. The things that might or might not exist. Let's talk about the edge of the map in medieval cartography. Unexplored lands were often filled with illustrations of mythical creatures, cynocephali, dog-headed men, Blemmy's people with faces in their chests, or monopods, one-legged giants who used their massive foot as a sun umbrella. Sounds silly maybe, but to many Europeans, these weren't jokes, they were warnings. And here's the historical truth of the night. Many maps of the era included these beings alongside actual cities, rivers, and trade routes, because to medieval minds, strangeness didn't mean falsehood, it meant distance or danger. That's your unpopular detail. Here be dragons isn't just poetic, it's practical paranoia. You reach a clearing with a stone slab in the centre. It's covered in images, birds with human heads, a fish with the tail of a peacock, and something labelled manticore, a red lion with a human face and a venomous stinger on its tail. Why were people convinced these things existed? Simple. Because other people told them so. Medieval travel books, especially those inspired by writers like Sir John Mandeville, or even early versions of Marco Polo's accounts, were full of monsters. And because few people could verify anything outside their village, these stories gained traction. Let's say you lived in 1290 and someone told you that beyond the desert lived men who had no heads but eyes in their shoulders. You couldn't Google it. You couldn't even walk there. So, belief filled the gaps. And sometimes those gaps bit back. There's an academic debate still ongoing, yes. Another one about whether these creatures were ever believed literally. Some historians say no, they were symbolic, pedagogical, moral tools. Others insist, based on the intensity of written descriptions and the sheer consistency across manuscripts, that belief was real. You sit on the stone slab, the cold creeps through your bones. Suddenly, from behind the bush is a whimper. You freeze. It steps out, dog-shaped, but its face is wrong, too flat, too human. Don't panic, it's not real, except it was. Cynocephaly appear in dozens of medieval texts. Some even describe saintly versions who converted to Christianity. One legend says St. Christopher was a cynocephalus before he was baptized. So yes, you could be both holy and horrifying. Medieval theology was weird like that. But let's not forget most of these monsters weren't just biological puzzles. They were social puzzles. They lived far away. They looked different. They worshipped differently or didn't worship at all. So when you hear that the Blemmies were said to eat raw flesh and never pray, or that the Cyapod refuses clothes and lives alone, what you're really hearing is anxiety, cultural projection. This is medieval othering. And here comes your callback from earlier. Remember the mirror in the medieval zoo. This is the same trick. Monster as metaphor, alien as mirror. You label the unknown as monstrous, not because you understand it, but because you don't. Back on the path, you find a wooden sign. Turn back. Traveller, the world grows stranger. You keep walking, obviously, because now we reach the most curious phenomenon of all the medieval monster compendium. Yes, it's a thing. Manuscripts like the Aberdeen Bestiary, the Physiologus, and the Vatican Mythographies compiled not only animals but monsters. Real drawings, real taxonomies, even pseudo-scientific explanations. One page might say, the unicorn cannot be captured unless a virgin sits quietly nearby. A surprisingly specific hunting tip. Another claims, the manticore's laugh sounds like a flute, but brings death to any child who hears it. Okay, and here's a delightful little medieval joke. Some compilers were smart enough to insert satire. One bestiary notes that the barnacle goose doesn't hatch from eggs, it grows on trees over the sea, which was probably a lazy workaround for Lenten fasting rules. If it grows, it's not meat. Right, but some monks took it seriously. Your random oddity of the night. The Pope once had to issue a clarification that barnacle geese are, in fact, birds. Yes, that had to happen. You're now standing at the edge of a cliff. The fog parts below, revealing a churning sea, and there it is, a shape, moving beneath the water, bigger than a boat, with eyes. Some medieval sailors swore by the kraken, others believed it was just a very lonely whale, but the result was the same. You feared the sea not for its depth, but for what might surface before you leave this place. There's one last whisper: the monsters of the medieval mind weren't just beasts or foreigners or mysteries. They were reminders that the world is vast, that understanding is fragile, that the further you stray from home, the more you carry your fears with you. And sometimes, when you stare into the woods too long, your fears grow eyes. Don't blink. You wake in a field of stone heads, silent mouths, sightless eyes. Some smile, others scream, but none speak. Because tonight, you've wandered into the weirdest cabinet of curiosities the medieval world ever made the reliquary of the imagination. No, that's not a real place, but it might as well be. Because in this chapter of history, the line between artifact and fantasy blurs into something strange, sacred, and a little absurd. You reach for one of the heads, it crumbles in your fingers, revealing pages beneath the stone, parchment, ink. Someone has written down their fears here, or their hopes. Maybe both. Tonight's story, it's about the physical remains of belief. You walk through a village marketplace, somewhere in the 14th century France. Wooden stalls creak under the weight of relics, a thorn from Christ's crown, a vial of the Virgin's milk, a feather from the Archangel Gabriel's wing. One merchant swears he's got St. Peter's actual footprint in a rock. Another offers you the finger bone of St. Margaret, helpfully split in half so you can share the blessing with a friend. Because, yes, relics were sometimes wholesale. Our historical fact of the night: relics were an economy. Entire towns gained fame and revenue from the prestige of hosting even the tiniest scrap of a saint. Churches were built to house skulls. Wars were fought over toes. A piece of cloth stained with martyr's blood could raise enough donations to repair a cathedral roof. You step into a cathedral now, its bones echo with whispers. Candles flicker against gilded cages of bone and glass. There's a reliquary shaped like an arm, holding an arm. Another shaped like a whole person, hollow inside but labelled Saint Blaise. You start to notice something odd. There are too many pieces. 3 heads of John the Baptist, 5 shrouds of Turin. And don't even ask how many fragments of the true cross exist. It's enough to build a medium-sized treehouse. Here's your rare detail. There's a medieval joke that if you gathered all the nails from the true cross, you could arm a blacksmith's forge for a year. The church eventually acknowledged the oversupply issue, but only after several embarrassing audits by skeptical bishops. You sit beneath a stained glass window. Light fractures across your skin in red and blue halos. A priest walks by, swinging a censer. The air smells like history, or maybe just mouldy incense. He tells you this: not all relics come from saints, some come from monsters. And now you're interested, because here's where the medieval world gets extra spicy. People didn't just collect bones, they collected proof, or so they thought, of everything strange they'd ever feared. A tooth from a dragon, locked in a Florentine vault, a jar labelled blood of the basilisk, a claw from the creature that tempted St. Anthony. Were they real? Of course not. But were they believed sometimes? Absolutely. You wander deeper into the crypt. Each room gets darker, older. One chamber houses the tail of Leviathan, a twisted piece of fossilized wood, presented as a biblical sea monster souvenir. Another contains the tongue of a giant, which might just be a dried-out cow organ. No one's checking. Here's the debate. Some scholars argue these artifacts were spiritual metaphors, never meant to be taken literally. Others point to pilgrim testimonies, donation records, and the sheer volume of inventory is evidence that many people did believe. This wasn't museum tourism, it was devotion. And belief, when wrapped in gold and incense, becomes very hard to fact-check. You find a reliquary shaped like a little house, inside a mirror, beneath it a plaque that reads "The only true relic." You look into it, yep, it's your own face, well played. Medieval sarcasm. That brings us to the most elaborate relic hoaxes in history. One of the most notorious, the holy foreskin. Yes, you read that right. Several European churches claim to possess the foreskin of Christ. One version was even paraded through Rome during feast days. Theologians debated whether it had ascended with the rest of his body. One monk claimed to have seen it float back down during prayer. Your oddity of the night, in 1900 the Vatican quietly banned discussion of the holy foreskin under threat of excommunication. Apparently, some mysteries are better left untouched. You pass a reliquary encased in iron, labelled the sound of the trumpet at Jericho. It's empty, but still, people leave coins beside it, because what matters most isn't what's in the box, it's what you imagine. And here comes your call back from earlier. Remember the dog-headed saint? His relics supposedly cured madness. People travelled for weeks just to kiss a box with cynocephalus mandible engraved on it. Faith, after all, doesn't need proof, just presence. You're almost out now. One last chamber. This one is full of bones. So many bones. Labelled, sorted, shelved. A skull with gold teeth called the laugh of St. Apollonia. A pelvis bone inscribed with a single word, hope. You start to wonder if maybe this whole chapter of history is less about proof and more about comfort. Holding on to something. Anything. Because belief isn't always rational. It's often emotional. And sometimes it looks like a box full of dust, guarded by monks, prayed over by generations. You step outside, the wind has picked up, but in your hand, something remains, a tiny splinter of old wood, taken from the altar. Is it part of the true cross? Of course not. But tonight, it feels like it might be, and maybe that's enough. The forest breathes, not like trees in the wind, but like lungs. You don't notice it at first, not until your steps begin to fall in sync with something deeper, something older. Tonight, you've wandered off the road and into a different kind of medieval mystery, the monstrous wilderness. And no, this isn't the kind of place where you stop for a scenic picnic. This is the realm where boundaries blur between the human and the wild, the real and the imagined. So, you keep walking, and the trees keep watching. This part of the world doesn't have borders on a map. It exists in the minds of those who feared it, and in the texts of monks who try to catalogue it. Because here's a little-known historical detail. Many medieval bestiaries, those illustrated books of animals, were not just zoological records, they were moral guides. Lions represented Christ, owls meant darkness and ignorance, and the unicorn purity and virginity. Naturally, because of course the most magical horse imaginable had to be obsessed with chastity. But here's where it gets more interesting the further the creature lived from Europe. The weirder it became. People believed these animals existed, even if they'd never seen them. After all, Pliny the Elder said so was a very legitimate citation back then. You hear a rustle in the undergrowth. You pause. Don't worry, it's just a medieval elephant, which back then was described as a combination of a bull, a fortress, and a volcano. Accurate. Not quite, but they tried. One manuscript depicts an elephant as a massive grey pig with antlers and fire coming out of its nostrils. You almost feel bad for medieval artists sometimes. And now we arrive at your historical truth of the chapter. The medieval world didn't draw a clear line between animal and monster. Every beast had meaning, and every unfamiliar shape was something to fear or worship. You move past twisted trees covered in moss, and arrive at a stone circle. In the centre a carving of a creature you don't recognise. It has wings, hooves, and a human face. There's a name beneath it, Sheepod. You recall this one from earlier. is the one-legged creature that shaded itself with its giant foot. Scholars still debate whether it was just a traveller's exaggerated story or something more symbolic. And here's your strange but true fact. Some cyanopods were described as perfectly peaceful, until you tried to take their shade. A medieval lesson in boundaries. Apparently, then you meet the Blemmy, remember those? The headless men with faces in their chests, you find a statue of one, holding a scroll that says, "We are like you." Except for the neck. That's oddly poetic, and kind of accurate. There's a growing sense now that you're not alone in this forest, but you're not in danger. These monsters aren't predators, they're metaphors, or maybe memories, or maybe something that lives in the forgotten corners of your brain where childhood fears still whisper. You pass a tree where something has been nailed to the bark pages, torn from a traveller's diary. Met an ox with a man's face. He asked for bread, then vanished. Dreamt of it again that night. You look up. The stars flicker through the canopy. The air smells like moss and ink. Then a voice. Not loud, not threatening. Just curious. You still think monsters aren't real. You turn, but no one's there. The voice continues. They existed. Maybe not like you think, but in minds and choices and fears. And now we hit tonight's ongoing scholarly debate. Were these monsters believed as literal beings, or were they allegories? Were they ways to explain distant lands, strange people, and anxieties about change? Many historians argue that medieval monsters reflect the edges of European identity, the other, creatures with no heads, with dog faces, or with tails weren't just weird, they were a way to say. That's not us. But others counter some travellers claim to have met them, and artists depicted them in such detail. It's hard not to sense some level of belief. You come across a pond, in the reflection not yourself, but a face stitched from many others, a lion's snout, a fish's eyes, a human mouth. It smiles at you. Time for tonight's third callback. Remember the dragon reliquary from last chapter. Turns out, this forest has its own kind of relics. You find a nest, inside eggs made of silver, each etched with a different fear loss. Change, hunger, war, the things monsters were really made of. Then a clearing opens, and there, you find the final beast of the forest. It's enormous, towering, but familiar. It looks like you, and it watches you the same way you watch the others, with curiosity, not threat. You realise this whole forest is built from reflections, mirrors of fear, echoes of what people didn't understand. And when you name something a monster, sometimes you're just giving shape to confusion. You sit beneath its gaze. It doesn't move. It doesn't need to. You hear one last whisper. The forest doesn't lie, but it does remember. And you wonder what memories you leave behind in this world. Then slowly, you rise, the trees shift. The air lightens. You step out of the monstrous wilderness and back into the quieter, more predictable world. But you'll never look at shadows the same way again. The wind has changed. You feel it in the bones of the castle as you pass through its stone corridors. This is where monsters end and where meaning begins. Tonight, you're not out in the dark woods or crawling through a plague-infested alley. You're in a library, but not just any library. This one is built inside a former cathedral, and the only things more sacred than the relics inside are the stories themselves. Because now, we're stepping into the strangest question of all. Did medieval people think the monsters were real? Or were they just trying to say something deeper? The stained glass above you depicts St. George slaying a dragon again. You've seen him a dozen times on this journey, haven't you? Same raised sword, same poor lizard creature being stabbed in the face. But maybe the story was never about reptiles at all. Here's your historical fact for tonight, in medieval sermons. The dragon almost always symbolised the devil, chaos, or sin. And St. George, he was your ideal knight, not just in armour but in purity. So every time someone told that story, they weren't giving a zoology lecture, they were giving a moral lesson. You pass a dusty shelf and find a bestiary, a real one this time, bound in leather, ink faded, You flip it open. There's the manticore lion's body, scorpion tail, and a man's face, because why not? But in the margins, someone has written notes. One reads, "Symbol of treachery. Beware those who smile too often." Another page shows a basilisk chicken body. Snake eyes, killer gaze. Marginal note, "As pride slays kings." So here's your uncommon insight. Monsters were like medieval emojis. Seriously. They were visual shortcuts for things too complex or terrifying to name outright. Jealousy basilisk. Lust sirens. Foreign invaders, dog-headed men. You know, the usual metaphors. But what makes this even better is that there were arguments. Yes. Medieval scholars fought over monster definitions. One famous debate still discussed today asks, were monsters part of God's plan? Or evidence of nature gone wrong? Think about that for a second. If God made everything, why make a creature with 2 heads and a tail that spits bees? Some thinkers, like Isidore of Seville, insisted that monsters existed to show God's power even in deformity. Creation is ordered. Others weren't so sure. Maybe monsters were the product of sin, or just too much bad wine in the desert. Now, your path leads to a vault. You open it. Inside are relics we haven't seen before, manuscripts from Ethiopia, Persia, China, and guess what? They have monsters too, and they look nothing like the European ones. But they serve the same purpose. They help explain the edges of the world, the unknown. And that's your callback. Remember those early maps where the oceans were filled with fish-headed people and sea serpents the size of cities? It wasn't just ignorance. It was a way to say, we don't know what's there, but we fear it. So here's a creature to hold the fear for us. You leave the vault, return to the central aisle of the cathedral library, and there it is, your final monster. It's not drawn, it's not sculpted. It's a mirror, just a regular medieval bronze mirror. And when you look into it, your reflection stares back. You're wearing the pilgrim's cloak you started this whole journey with. You've walked through catacombs, fought off fever dreams, talked to headless monks and one-legged philosophers, and all along, the monsters haven't chased you. They've revealed you. Tonight's last debated truth. Modern historians still argue over how real these monsters were. Some say medieval people truly believed in manticores and dragons. Others argue that belief isn't the point. What mattered was how the stories shaped lives, guided behaviour, and gave meaning to the chaos of existence. And you don't need to decide right now. You just know that the monsters were never random. They were necessary. You walk outside the cathedral. Dawn is breaking. The light isn't harsh, it's soft, like a veil lifting. And somewhere deep inside, you realise the monsters were never just in books or maps. They've always been how we understand the unknown. And maybe, just maybe, they're still with us. You take a breath, a deep grounding one. Not in fear, but in peace. Because the monsters are resting now. And so can you. The journey is over now. You're still, tucked under blankets or resting your head on something warm. The sounds of the medieval world, the groaning timbers, the chanting monks, the soft breathing of monsters in dreams are fading, gently, slowly, like smoke in the wind. You've wandered far tonight, through plague and parchment, forest and fog. You've touched myths shaped by candlelight, by fear, by longing. You've seen beasts with too many eyes, people with no heads, and birds that whispered prophecies into sleeping ears, and you made it through. You always do. The pages have closed, the ink has dried, and though the monsters may return again in stories, in whispers, in moments when the world feels too wide, you now know them. They don't frighten you. They're old friends, symbols, lessons, guardians of ancient fears, made harmless in your hands. So let the shadows grow softer. Let your breath slow. Let the flickering images of the past drift back into the fog from where they came. You are safe. You are still. You are enough. And as the final echoes of hoofbeats, growls, and medieval murmurs die down, there's only your breath now, and sleep